I'm Niamani Mutima, and I'm the Executive Director of the Africa Grantmakers Affinity Group. Well, I've been working in African development issues for probably about 30 years. I'm an anthropologist by training, a writer and a theater person, but I became involved in Africa, I guess, in 1975 when I took my first trip to Senegal. And as an African American, I got enchanted by Africa because the more I've learned about Africa, the more I've learned about myself. And so I worked in African development for about 20 years, traveling in Africa, working with both private sector and public sector institutions and individuals. And then about 10 years ago, I was recruited by the foundations who formed the Africa Grantmakers Affinity Group to help them grow this idea of a network of foundations who fund in Africa, who want to form a community of practice. Wow, that's a long continuum. I guess I have a couple of observations on that. Before coming to work with this group of grant makers, I worked on a project that was funded by the United States Agency for International Development. And I think that from my perspective, I was doing development. When I came to work with the Africa Grantmakers Affinity Group, I began to realize that perhaps grant making and development were slightly different. And I think that Africa has changed a lot over the last 30 years. I think philanthropy has matured. I think it's a very different landscape for philanthropy now than even 10 years ago when I first started working with the Affinity Group. I think there are many more actors on the field. I think there are different types of actors. But I think most importantly, I think there's been a maturing in terms of socioeconomic development in African countries. And so the idea and the concept of philanthropy, of charity, of development, you know, that the engine for all of that isn't necessarily one that comes from the outside. And I think there's a realization of that. I also think that we're in a new time frame. I mean, it's 2010, and I come from a country that has a Kenyan American as a president. So, you know, I think that's historic for a whole lot of reasons, and it also signals that it's not business as usual, and that we're a global society now. Well, I think the formation of the African Grantmakers Network is a culmination of a lot of factors that have come into play. Historic, I guess so. I mean, I don't really know the history of philanthropy, but I would dare say in the time that I've been working in it, I've not come to a meeting of a formalized group of African grantmakers. Many of the members of the African Grantmakers Network are also a member of the Africa Grantmakers Affinity Group, and rightly so, because that's a network of foundations that fund in Africa, U.S., African, as well as European. But I think that it signals a different kind of energy that says that, one, you have enough wealth within Africa that you have philanthropists, one, who can have foundations. I think, two, I think it's also signals a moment where Africans who are involved in philanthropy want to shape the narrative in a different kind of way. I think that it's important because I think that Africa, in terms of how the media has portrayed it, is always reaching its hand out as a place that needs, which actually goes against the grain. If you're a historian and you know what Africa is and what it has to offer, Africa has offered so many natural resources and continues to do so to the world. So I think that this event is important for a whole lot of reasons. I think it's really important to the field of philanthropy in Africa, whether it's being done by Africans or non-Africans, because I think it signals a global opportunity. Well, I guess the simple, answer to that is you have very competent and capable people who are playing very important roles in philanthropy in their countries and internationally as well. And so if they decide to come together and form a community of practice where they want to share information, they want to, shape the agenda, then I think that that's a good thing, and that if they believe in what they're doing and they're, focused, I think that it will definitely succeed. I mean, being someone who was at the forefront of helping to grow an idea of a similar type of network 10 years ago, I know how hard it is. And I think that one of the things that I think about when I listen to the deliberations of AGN is that they will have to manage expectations, because there's so many things that I've heard articulated today that their colleagues and that the community expects from them. And so I think that's going to be really probably one of their biggest challenges, is to manage expectations. And when I say manage expectations, I mean that philanthropy, like any other field, has its parameters. And if, as we talked about today, we're talking about a, quote, different type of philanthropy, then I think it's important to talk about what that is. I think one of the other things about today, when you talk about the framework of the philanthropy practices, philanthropy is framed by the culture and the community that undertakes it. And it is not something that is just undertaken, by the West, by a very young country like the United States. I think philanthropy happens when people come together and they decide that they feel that there but for the grace of God go I. And so therefore, if their brother is not doing well or their sister's not doing well, then they're not doing well. Right. So when I hear the conversation and the discussion, I think there are several elements here. I think we're talking about not only philanthropy, we're talking about culture. And we're talking about how does one do philanthropy in a culturally comfortable way. How do you put on the coat of an African philanthropist that fits and that feels good, and that doesn't scratch because you're wearing the coat of a philanthropist perhaps from Europe or, the United States or North America. So I think that what's happening today is that people are defining how they want to shape a particular field. I think they're defining and grappling with how they want to do it. I think they're grappling with how do you relate to the inside as well as the outside. With telecommunications, and I was in Washington, D.C. 2 days ago. In 18 hours I'm here in Nairobi. So we're in a global world now. It makes it a lot more complicated to be someone who focuses and who works not only with your community, but with leaders from other countries. So I think that for me, AGN is very exciting, because I've always believed that it's important for people to define themselves and to define what it is that they want to do. I think that it's a lot of hard work. I think that gathering people together and trying to get everybody's head around the same ideas is difficult regardless of who you are and what you are. So I think that the assumptions that because these are African grant makers and because there's a shared cultural approach to how one lives one's life, I think are good things, and as an anthropologist they can contribute to the cohesion, but they can also be issues where it makes it difficult to come together. So, I mean, for me, I look at the group and I look at the work that I've done with the Africa Grantmakers Affinity Group, and we're 10 years old, and it's taken us a real long time to just get to the point that I feel like we've gelled. We've got a community that people come to our annual retreat every year just because they want to make sure that they connect with their colleagues. So it becomes like a must-attend event. I think it takes a lot of hard work to do that. And we're primarily dealing with grant makers in one country. And AGN is talking about dealing with grant makers that are spread across a continent that is huge, that has a lot of different countries. So I think that, I'm excited. I think it's a good opportunity. I'm excited about the possibilities of Africa Grant Makers and the African Grant Makers Network coming together and finding places where we can collaborate and work together. What I'm kind of hoping is that this means that we'll eventually move beyond whether you're African, not African, But the important thing is that you care about Africa. And that if you can all come together around that, then I think that's when we've really gotten to something that's really... Well, you know, I remember Nelson Mandela saying that he did not like a tyrant, regardless of what color they came into. So I think that Western funding agencies are not the enemy. I think that what happens is that anyone who comes from outside of your community, who doesn't know you and doesn't perhaps even take the time to ask you, although many do, are going to, you know, they're going to rub you the wrong way. You know, I think that what I'd like to see is less of a tone of antagonism and more of a tone of cooperation. But in saying that, I'm not saying that African grant makers should in any way dilute their posture and their position. What I am saying is that donors, whether they're African, American, French, whatever, they have the resources and they want their resources used in a particular kind of way. I think that's just human nature. And I think it's historic, but I think that is worth maybe about, 2 minutes of reflection. I think it's more important now to get on with the work.